Hello, NG India. So my name is Kasia. I work at Highland as a software developer, and I come from Poland to teach you about the SSR and the incremental hydration. So rendering. Very often we can see different types of rendering. So we have a client-side rendering, we have static site generation, the server-side rendering. The client-side rendering, maybe even if you didn't know this name, I'm sure that all of you already know what it is, because this is just a regular way the Angular renders your application. So basically, the server sends all of the files into the browser, the JavaScript kicks in, and everything is rendered. So the browser is responsible for doing all of the job. However, and if we inspect the page source to see the HTML that is sent by our server into the browser, you will see that all you get is this empty template. So it's only the app root and no DOM content at all, because it's the JavaScript that executes that is in charge of rendering all of the DOM. However, for the server-side rendering, it's the server that is responsible for rendering the HTML. So the already rendered page is sent to the browser. So now, if we inspect the page source to see what is sent by our server, you will see that all of the DOM content is already populated. So even the data that is pulled from some external API is already there. So nice, we have a rendered page, but there is one problem. The page is static. So what can we do about it? Well, one way to handle it could be to reload everything. So we can reload it on the browser, pull the JavaScript, and yes, now our page is nice, interactive, the user can play with it, but it's not a very good solution. So this is how it used to be handled by Angular Universal back in the old days, and it would cause this very ugly glitch when the page was reloading. However, now we have a better solution for this, and the solution is called hydration. So what is hydration? I'm sure this guy knows about hydration. It's very important, especially in the India climate. However, if you navigate to Angular documentation, you will see that hydration is the process that restores the server-side rendered application on the client. So in other words, hydration is the process that makes your website interactive again. Okay, so basically, the server renders the HTML. It sends already rendered website into the browser, and then the hydration kicks in, which makes your page interactive again. So this is all nice, but there is one problem with it. We hydrate all of the page at once. So now with Angular 19, we have a new cool feature that is incremental hydration. And with the incremental hydration, we can control which part of our website is hydrated and under what condition. Okay, let's get to the code examples. So first, of course, we have to enable the SSR. And how do we do it? If we create a new application, we just create it with the SSR flag. Wow. Okay. It's good. Maybe you can see this better now. So when you create a new application, you can just add the SSR flag. If you would like to add the SSR to already existing application, you can do it with the ng-add command. And Angular will scaffold everything for you. And when you run your application, you will see that at the build time, there are actually two groups of bundles generated. So we have the browser bundles and the server bundles. Because the very important thing is that now we are no longer dealing with a single application, but we are dealing with two applications. The server-side application and the client application. Okay, so we have now our SSR up and running. We have to enable hydration. And as already Michael shown on his presentation, all you have to do is go to your app config, provide client hydration, And if you want to enable the incremental hydration, you just have to do it with incremental hydration. And that's it. Now your SSR application is hydration enabled and it's up and running. Okay, so how do we control the hydration? Well, we can use the defer block that you've just learned about on the previous presentation. And you can use very similar triggers like for the defer, except now notice that there is this hydrate keyword inside. So you can hydrate on idle once the browser gets in the idle state, but you can hydrate on any other trigger, or even you can create your own custom trigger. And there is one more trigger that was not there for the defer, and this is the hydrate never. So basically it means that the component that's inside the defer never block will never be hydrated. So let's see this in action to understand why we might need this. For a sample, I created a very simple application. It's of course rendered on the server, and each of these tiles is wrapped in a different defer hydrate block. So there is the one that will be hydrated on idle, but also the one that will be hydrated on interaction, and so on. So if I enter my application, I can see that some of our tiles are already hydrated. There is the one that's hydrated only on interaction and on hover. And when I scroll down, there is one hidden block that got only hydrated once it appeared in the viewport. However, there was this one tile that was never hydrated. So what it means, it's basically only the pure content, but it's not interactive at all. But what happens if we start navigating around our application? Okay, I navigated somewhere, I came back, and all of a sudden, all of my tiles are hydrated. And why is this? This is because once we are in the browser, we are no longer thinking about the server, right? So everything now is handled by the browser. The server-side rendering is only about this first enter on the web page. So when the user navigates to your website, the content is rendered on the server. But once it's pulled to the browser, now we are all in the browser context, and we don't have to worry anything about any SSR-related things. So, having all this, should I even enable SSR? Well, SSR can give you a couple of benefits. So, first of the benefit is the faster initial page load. Because the website is rendered on the server, we don't need to wait for all the JavaScript to be pulled, to kick in. So this initial load is way faster, and the user can see the contents way faster. And if we enable the incremental hydration, we can further make it even faster because the interactivity is available quicker, because we only hydrate parts of our page that are the most important. All this is also resulting in the better SEO and better social media sharing, because this content is already rendered. When we have search engines crawling the internet, they immediately have all of the contents. They don't need to do any rendering by themselves. When we share our page on media like Facebook or Instagram, we can immediately have the access to meta tags to generate the previews. So all in all, we have the enhanced user experience. However, as always, everything comes at the price. So if you enable SSR, you have to remember that you add this extra layer of complexity. So first thing, you are no longer dealing with one application, but you are dealing with two applications. So you have the server-side application and the client application. Also, if you render it on the server, you don't have the access to browser API. So it means that you cannot use objects like window or document. You cannot use the local storage. You cannot use session storage. And even if you remember about it in your own code, you have to remember that if you use the third-party libraries, they might depend on window or document objects, and this can cause failure on your code. Also, if your application is using authentication, you need to take care of it to make sure that all the session keys are passed correctly to your target API. Also, if you enable hydration, it has a couple constraints as well. So the HTML that is produced by the server has to be exactly the same on the client side, because the hydration needs to know how to operate. If you do any DOM manipulation in between this process, you will see very nasty hydration errors. Also, your HTML structure has to be valid. So you have to remember that if you create, for example, a table, don't forget your T-body or T-head tags. You cannot do a P tag, you cannot do a div inside a P tag or an A inside another A and other invalid, semantically invalid HTML. Also, at this moment, the custom or noob zone.js is not supported. So what do I do if I have these nasty hydration errors? Well, fortunately, these errors are pretty descriptive. So if you read the error contents, you will most probably instantly know what's going on. But usually, the most common hydration errors are the invalid HTML or some DOM manipulation. But if you have to do a DOM manipulation, the good news is that you can use the after next render lifecycle hook, because this will execute after the hydration is completed. Also, if your content is important and you want the content to be rendered on the server, but for some reason it cannot be hydrated correctly, you can defer it in the hydrate never block. Also, if your content isn't as much important and you can pull it later, you can just use the regular defer block. This will only render the placeholder on the server, and all of the contents of defer will be pulled later after your website is in the browser. Also, in the worst case scenario, you can just use the ng-skip hydration. This will cause skipping the hydration process and just reloading your page on the browser. So we have all this knowledge now, and the question is, should we enable the SSR? Michael says no. Well, I say it depends. So I created this flowchart. You can take a picture if you want. But my general advice is that if you are creating a public-facing application, if the SEO is important for you, then you should really consider enabling SSR. So, for example, if you are working with e-commerce websites, or maybe some dynamic landing pages, a blog, news pages, then think about SSR. For more static content, I would recommend the static site generation. But if you are working on an admin panel or some other internal application like a corporate website, then SSR is probably an overkill. It will cause you more trouble than benefit. So always very carefully think about your use case and adjust your solution. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me.